When I asked for respect and my voice broke, someone behind Evan whispered, "The babysitter is nervous," and the thin sound of it slid under my ribs like a paper cut that wouldn't bleed, only sting. The hallway air tasted like paper and burnt coffee, that particular courthouse blend of toner dust and caffeine gone stale. File carts rattled over seams in the tile, and each clatter felt like a countdown I hadn't agreed to start. I kept my thumb on the recorder button in my pocket the way a swimmer keeps a hand on the pool edge before a race. Not to jump early, only to know I wouldn't drown when I finally pushed off. I had rehearsed the sentence. "Your Honor, I am the parent," so many times that the words felt foreign, a motel room version of home. But even practice can't account for how voices echo here, how strangers' coughs and counsel's jokes braid into something that sounds like the truth if you let it. I didn't intend for my voice to crack. It was 2 seconds at most, a tremor that announced grief before logic. But the second it happened, I heard the titter in Evan's row, small enough to deny, mean enough to savor. I watched my coffee cool in the bench's shadow, and I thought about last Tuesday at 5:47 a.m., when I measured my daughter's breaths while the steam rose straight from the humidifier and the kitchen clock forgot the seconds because our house was quiet enough to make time shy. Fever night and the school portal login under my name, and the nurse's voicemail thanking me for the inhaler checklist taped to the backpack. This was the real record, the one the hallway couldn't hear. I slid my blue accordion folder closer, felt the weight of attendance logs, pediatric portal screenshots, therapy invoices with my credit card stamp, and the teacher voicemails transcribed by an app that never sleeps. The paper wasn't heavy, not really. It only felt heavy because every page had a morning in it. I told myself not to look at Evan, and I failed, because that is what a history does. It drags your face toward the person who will benefit from your distraction. He stood with his lawyer, Pierce, tall and polished, both of them practicing the elegance of indifference, and I felt my anger go from hot to steady, a better temperature for accuracy. Ms. Dale, the evaluator, hovered with a clipboard she never wrote on in front of me, smiling the way people smile when they want you to absorb instructions without noticing you're being managed. "You'll be fine," she said, and the sentence had no place to land. Clerks corrected my form number, but let the babysitter word hang like a banner no one remembered hanging. Men are allowed to be calm. Women are required to be. I could feel the policy behind that belief creak like a door that only opens inward. Nora, my attorney, pressed the side of her hand to my shoulder in a gesture that said, "Both wait and I'm here." And we reviewed the order of exhibits not because we didn't know it, but because repetition is a life raft in rooms like this. Attendance logs first, because the afternoons were the quiet battlefield. Pediatric portal next, because medicine doesn't lie unless someone tells it to. Therapy invoices to show continuity. Teacher voicemails to color the data with human sound. The word parent kept scudding through my head like a leaf in street wind I couldn't catch. Not capitalized, not owned, just present. And every time I reached for it, the babysitter jeer tugged at my sleeve. The voice crack bothered me because it stood in for every night I swallowed a sob in the laundry room, so my daughter wouldn't hear me fold fear into towels. I wanted to be the kind of woman who never wavers, who answers mockery with a courtroom tone that crests at exactly the right syllable. But I am also the woman who kneels to tie a sneaker while reciting sight words and who tapes a note over the lunchbox that says, "I'm proud of you," before a spelling quiz. That woman's voice sometimes breaks. The justice system is not a mother, but it will hear from one today. I let myself feel the shame like a match struck in the wind. Flare, dark, and I cupped the ember until it became light I could read by. "Remember the order," Nora said, eyes on mine, and I nodded, aware that the only thing worse than the hallways chorus would be bringing the hallway into the courtroom with me. I pictured the judge's bench not as a cliff, but as a table where paper is asked to do what memory can't. I pictured my daughter at school, the way she tips her head to listen to the librarian read, the way she counts the blue tiles to the drinking fountain. The babysitter word had been designed to make those images look like anecdotes instead of evidence. That's what spin does. It recasts devotion as trivia. My hands shook once, twice, and then I set them flat on the folder, and the tremor found the edge of the paper and stopped there. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hand steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets. Let the paper speak, and let my child lift his head. I would not trade my voice for their comfort. I would not trade my child's mornings for anyone's image of calm. Calm can be purchased. Mornings are earned. The hallway's fluorescent hum faded into a silence I chose. A small private room behind my ribs where the word parent could sit down and put on its shoes. Ms. Dale asked if I needed water, and I said no, not because I didn't, but because I had already drunk every time-stamped fact I'd brought, and you cannot dilute truth on the day you need it concentrated. Pierce laughed at something Evan whispered, and I let the sound pass through me like weather. I remembered the night the smoke alarm chirped at 2:13 a.m., how I stood on the chair and changed the battery while my daughter slept, how ordinary heroics never make it into affidavits unless the person writing them loves the subject more than the story. If we were going to tell a story today, it would be the story of minutes, not moods. I rolled the silver locket between my fingers, the one with her school photo, uneven bangs, and the soft stubbornness of a child who will someday refuse to apologize for speaking first. I promised her then, silently and aloud, that I would not surrender our mornings to a vocabulary error. My voice could break, my facts would not. I pressed the recorder once, felt the click, a tiny metronome for courage, and slid it deep in my pocket, close enough to feel like a companion, far enough to be unobtrusive. There are rooms where you perform poise. There are rooms where you build it out of paper and breath. The hallway clock coughed another minute forward. The coffee cooled past use. The clerk shuffled, the door sighed, and the crowd adjusted itself into the kind of stillness that precedes either ceremony or storm. I lifted the blue folder, tested its hinge, and felt the weight become carryable, a thing with handles given to me by the very people who thought weight would slow me down. If I have to carry this alone, I will. If I have to say parent until the word is all anyone hears, I will do that too. The bailiff calls our case, as Pierce wheels in a glossy binder stamped primary caregiver, father, and every eye turns as if the title itself could change the facts I am about to place on the record. A single word crossed the PTA faster than any fact I had collected, and by the time I reached the courtroom door it had already circled back, wearing my face like a borrowed mask and asking strangers to decide who I was before they ever read a line of my life. The moment the bailiff called our case, I felt how quickly a nickname can turn into a verdict, how the echo from one offhand joke can travel through school hallways and soccer fields until it becomes a kind of crowd memory, unmoored from the person it names. On the neighborhood Facebook page, a photo of Evan tying our daughter's cleat sat above a caption about hands-on dads, and the comments bloomed with heart icons and familiar platitudes about how lucky she must be, a chorus that carefully ignored the date stamp on the picture, because acknowledging time would mean acknowledging the string of mornings before and after when the other pair of hands packed lunches, checked inhalers, and signed slips in a kitchen that smelled like oatmeal and coffee. On the sideline, a mom who had never asked me a single question about our custody schedule passed me a folding chair she would later describe as helping the sitter out, and the laugh that followed had the polished sound of something practiced, a performance stitched together from snapshots. The snapshots were strategic. That much I learned in increments. Evan posted Saturdays crowded with color, weekend museum lines and carousel tickets and matching sweaters under pumpkin farm banners, and he cropped me out of the few frames that could have. Told the story of weekdays. He understood how to stack perception like blocks, how to pose light against shadow until shadow read as absence rather than work. What he never posted were the school portal timestamps at 6:41 a.m., the medication reminders, the emergency contact forms that list one number first because the office asked which phone would answer at any hour, and I said mine without thinking it was a choice. He did not post a message from the nurse reminding me to upload the updated asthma plan or the voicemail from the speech therapist congratulating me on catching a schedule change before it cost us a session. He did not post the morning we counted 30 breaths together while the humidifier gave the room its small cloud and the clock softened into silence so I could listen for the tiny catch that would tell me whether to drive to school or to urgent care. When my voice cracked in the hallway, it was because all of that was crowded behind my teeth and the door between thinking and speaking swung too fast. I swallowed hard, steadied my hands on the blue folder, and reminded myself that a mother's work is measurable if you bring the right ruler. Screenshots, logs, receipts, emails, signatures, the tiny digital tracks that love leaves when it passes through routine. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hands steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets. Let the paper speak and let my child lift his head. I could not stop the rumor from walking, but I could make it trip over dates. The system does not pretend to be kind, it pretends to be neutral. In practice, that meant my tone was weighed like evidence while his was graded as leadership. The same way a tidy binder earns more points than the data inside it when the room is short on patience. "You sound upset," Ms. Dale had said during the home visit, and the note she wrote later translated that into a verdict about stability, even though the only unstable thing in my living room was the folding table I used as a desk after bedtime. Calmness looked like competence on him, urgency looked like trouble on me. When I paused for breath, Pierce called it defensiveness. When Evan paused, Pierce called it reflection. I watched the vocabulary tilt in real time and made a promise to write my minutes down in a way that would not depend on anyone's adjectives. So I built my case the way you build a morning, step by step, in order, without narration until the end. Early morning meds recorded on the app the pediatrician told us to use, with my login ping lighting at the same time every day. School portal entries with my initials beside the late slip I wrote when the car heater took too long, and we did sight words in the driveway rather than waste the warm air. Emergency contact logs with my name first, and the backup list I provided when I had to travel for one work conference and still wanted to be reachable if the teacher called. Therapy invoices with my card onto file, and the small note the office manager wrote at the bottom of the first statement, thanking me for staying on top of cancellations so no one was charged unnecessarily. Teacher voicemail saved and transcribed, voices that spoke our names into the record without knowing they were doing anything legal, only kind. The fever night lived under all of it, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was the opposite. It was the stutter in ordinary that proves who shows up. At 5:47 a.m., while Evan texted me that he had gone offline to prioritize sleep ahead of a presentation, I watched the digital thermometer blink toward normal, counted to 60 again, and then messaged the attendance office that she would be late or absent depending on the next hour. I brushed her hair away from her forehead and told her a story about the moon having a cold, and when she laughed, the laugh ran clear, a small bell that told the room we were winning. I took a photo of the medicine label and my kitchen clock and put them in a folder I named after the date, not because I thought I would need proof, but because I have learned that women's memories are considered essays while men's are filed as facts. In court, that difference hardens. Pierce kept circling back to calm, to presentation, to narrative, and I kept circling back to time. He described weekends, I described weekdays. He described impressions, I described entries. He described how happy our daughter looked on a carousel. I described who signed the permission slip and who refilled the prepaid lunch account on a Tuesday when the balance went red at 10:03 a.m. and I was on a conference call pretending to care about a spreadsheet while my finger found the school app and fixed a problem before it made its way to the cafeteria. The breadcrumb that would matter most sat tucked in the front sleeve of my folder, an ordinary parking receipt from the city kiosk, time-stamped to the minute on the morning he swore he handled drop-off alone. I had slid it there almost by accident, a habit of keeping small evidence near the top because it can be overlooked by people who think proof has to be glossy to be true. When Nora reached for the tab marked September, I knew we were about to lace the snapshot story back to the clock. She flips a page, the paper whispering like a warning, and says, "There's a fresh affidavit in the court file, under your name." My signature curved perfectly under a paragraph I'd never seen. Nora slid the photocopy across the polished table as if it might break, and the moment the page met my fingers, I felt what the internet can convey about paper, how cheap weight can try to impersonate gravity. The paragraph wore my rhythm but not my breath. The sentences leaned into claims I would never make, couching weekday care as intermittent support and positioning me as a secondary resource during periods of paternal leadership, language so careful it could only have been written by someone who believed precision could beat truth if it dressed sharply enough. I read the first line twice, then a third time, because repetition is a form of refusal. If I had to see those words under my name, I would make them say themselves out loud in my mind until they cracked. I knew my own pronoun habits the way I knew the slope of my daughter's shoulders when she's tired, how I carry we into almost every description of our mornings, how I use I only when responsibility requires it, how I never write the child where her name belongs. The affidavit said the child 4 times in 2 sentences, and the distance cut colder than the fluorescent light. My commas were misplaced as if someone had tried to imitate my pauses by counting rather than listening, and the formatting shifted halfway down the page, margins inching in as though the text had been pasted from one document into another and then bullied into alignment. Each line break wore its own logic. Each header announced a new rule it didn't follow. The signature at the bottom curved perfectly, too perfectly, like a tracing performed against the glass of a window at noon. The kind of line that looks right until you find the place where a human hand should hesitate and it doesn't. Acknowledge receipt, object to foundation, request chain of custody, and preserve the record for sanctions, Nora said, already writing the shorthand on her yellow legal pad, the ink thickening into a groove where her pen pressed harder than usual. My palm warmed around the locket at my neck, as if someone had set a small light behind the photo, and my recorder blinked red in my pocket, steady as a heartbeat I could borrow while mine considered skipping. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hand steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets. Let the paper speak, and let my child lift his head. I could feel the hallway's insult drifting back toward me, the soft laugh babysitter, and I let the word dissolve in the warm metal and the steady blink until the only thing left was ink and time. Pierce cleared his throat in a way that wanted to be mistaken for patience, and said the affidavit reflected my recent recantation of weekday responsibilities. The phrase recanted chosen with theological relish, as if muttering were a confession I had tried to take back after realizing God was watching. He gestured to the paragraph about how, given the father's stable schedule and consistent presence, the mother has embraced weekends as a nurturing focus, and I felt the room tilt while the sentence tried to push me into a corner decorated with craft projects and Saturday photographs. Nora objected, crisp and calm, and asked for the document's origin. Who drafted it? Who transmitted it? Who notarized it? Who handled it along the chain? Who stored the native file? Who printed this copy and attached it to a morning that did not belong to it? Your Honor, we'll establish foundation, Pierce said, already spinning forward into the part where foundation means momentum rather than origin. He wanted to talk about my tone. I wanted to talk about my timestamps. The footer carried one like a clue that thought it could hide in small print. Vito 1:12 a.m., the exact minute Evan had texted me let's be adults last month, when I'd asked him to stop posting our daughter's face to an audience of people who didn't know her bedtime. I felt the correspondence snap into a tidy braid, his midnight text, this footer, the way convenience finds its way under glass. Ms. Dale hovered at the edge of our table with the smile of a person who owns a calming app subscription, and when Nora asked if she had supplied or received the affidavit, she lifted her shoulders in a shrug that tried to look neutral and said, "Affidavits get messy." The words arranged themselves into a shield, and I watched them fail to cover what they intended to protect. Affidavits don't get messy. People make them messy, and the mess is always intentional. I pictured her home visit notes where she turned my sarcasm into confession. I pictured the emails where she aligned narratives like magnets on a refrigerator door, pulling unlike poles until they touched, and I understood that her shrug was not uncertainty but strategy. If everything is a little tangled, nothing can be clearly wrong. Nora pushed for chain of custody, the prosecutor's cadence threaded through a civil hearing, asking who touched the file and when, asking whether the signature had been compared against a known original with stroke analysis rather than a glance, asking whether the watermark on page 2 should really be present on a document allegedly drafted in the court's standardized template. She requested the native file and its metadata, full headers for any transmitting emails, and the notary's log with serial number. The court clerk blinked toward Pierce in a way that said this was not the morning he expected, and Pierce smiled with the tolerant frown men wear when they want credit for being charming while they refuse to answer. I read the paragraph again, slowly, absorbing how it smuggles certainty into qualifiers, how it deployed probably and generally and appears while pretending to land on always. I remembered the parking receipt in my folder's front sleeve, the school portal login that pinged at 6:41 a.m., the nurse's message about inhalers, and I imagined laying those things like stones on top of this paper until it couldn't move. I thought of my daughter sleeping with one hand open over the blanket, the posture of trust, and I put my own hand flat on the affidavit as if to measure whether the document had a pulse. It did. It was trying to wear mine. The judge asked for argument, and Nora made it clean. Foundation insufficient, authenticity disputed, prejudice substantial, request to strike now or reserve pending chain of custody proof into forensic comparison. Pierce responded with a weather report about conflict and presentation, a gentle drizzle of phrases that pretended to be facts. I looked at the bench and decided, again, that I would not trade substance for performance, not when the audience that mattered was at school, not when the paper I carried could build a bridge over any rumor if the court allowed it to stand. The judge leans back. The robe settles like a curtain before a second act, and he says, "Motion to strike denied at this time. I'll weigh credibility later. Proceed." Her smile looked clinical. Her notes read like a verdict. I had taught myself to study faces without getting trapped in them, but Ms. Dale's face was built like a waiting room. Calm colors, framed degrees, a neutrality that asked you to relax while it measured you. When she came to my apartment for the home visit, she smiled at the framed watercolor my daughter made in kindergarten and made a note about age-appropriate art. And I watched her pen hover over the word appropriate as if the page needed permission to consider us adequate. She measured the square footage with her eyes and complimented the light in the living room while I set out snacks and pulled the inhaler plant from the fridge, but I could tell where the weight of her gaze landed. She found calm in corners and wall space, and the way my bookshelf leaned against the stud, and she missed the choreography of our mornings, the inhaler timer that sings before the cereal gets soggy, the sock drawer game that turns minutes into wins, the small choreography that doesn't photograph well, but structures a child's day. If you listen closely, bias has a vocabulary. Stability, she wrote, equals space, and she underlined it as if the square footage could carry a child through an asthma flare at 3 a.m. "He presents calm," she said after visiting Evan's townhome, and I heard the hinge in that phrase, how presence elevates posture into proof, how a still voice in a glossy room becomes a credential when someone is eager to be impressed. I didn't hear presence applied to me. I heard efficient, diligent, responsive, as if love performed on a schedule forfeits its right to be called love. The report praised decor in sentences that pretended to be about environment, and I had the cooling sensation you get when you realize the test you studied for was swapped for one about threading curtains. I answered her questions about routines with dates and times and portal entries, and I watched her pencil pause not at the timestamps, but at the paint color on the hallway wall. The second visit was supposed to even the ledger. Evan would have the evaluator observe a weekday morning, not the curated Saturday. My yellow legal pad holds the timeline like a spine. We had it written, highlighted, bracketed with calendar invites that originated from her office. 2 days before, Ms. Dale emailed to reschedule because a conflict arose. And then, on the new date, she texted 15 minutes prior to arrival and asked to push by an hour so she could accommodate father's work cadence. The word cadence felt like flattery with a lapel pin. By the time she showed up, the morning had turned into something else. The inhaler was already done, the drop-off already signed, and she watched my daughter pick a library book while the breakfast dishes dried into dullness. When she wrote her notes, the canceled visit dropped into a euphemism, unable to observe, and the rescheduled observation morphed into a paragraph about how father's weekday stability remains commendable given professional demands. I learned again that the system is tender with male calendars. It folds around them like cloth. What I did say during the visit, that one stupid bitter sentence spoken like a joke so I would not cry, walked out of my kitchen wearing a new name. "I'm just a babysitter here," I said when Ms. Dale asked how decisions get made, and I followed it with a laugh that said, "We both know that's not true." And then I described the portal logins, the therapy calls, the inhaler checks, the deck of index cards we use for sight words because my daughter likes the feel of flipping accomplishments. In the report, sarcasm calcified into confession. Mother describes herself as just the babysitter during father's leadership weeks, Ms. Dale wrote, and the quotation marks closed on my throat like tiny silver cuffs. I could hear the hallway laughter again, the soft snort behind Evan like a rubber stamp hitting paper, and I held the yellow legal pad tighter to keep my hands from shaking in the slow, humiliating way adrenaline demands. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hands steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets. Let the paper speak and let my child lift his head. I stopped reading her adjectives and started inventorying her verbs. Presence, appears, suggests. Each one built an inch of plausible deniability into sentences that would later be read as facts by anyone skimming for a conclusion. I underlined presence in 3 colors and wrote beside it, "Not is." That was our strategy. We would impeach not the person, but the choices inside her language. Nora asked me to pull the calendar invites for the canceled Evan visit, the reschedule thread that used cadence like an honorific, and the unusual timestamp on the unable to observe note, which landed 10 minutes after the hour Ms. Dale spent at his house during the Saturday soccer practice he curated like a press conference. We lined the exhibits up like steps, email headers showing origin and time zones, the original calendar invitation from Ms. Dale's office, my reply that confirmed school start and inhaler timing, the text that slid the morning out of focus in order to fit the pleasant rhythm of a father who presents as calm. We added a portion of her report that elevated space over routine, comparing her attention to square footage with the line in my pediatric portal that documents every refill and the nurse's initials beside each update. Nora would take her through it slowly, not to embarrass, but to reveal the scaffolding. This wasn't about calling Ms. Dale a villain. It was about showing how an expert can stack furniture where a child needs a map. I kept touching the locket, the metal warming until it felt like a small furnace beneath my skin, and I pictured my daughter in the school library tracing the bumpy spines of nonfiction, choosing the book about whales because she likes the way those pages turn. I promised myself no one would turn my sarcasm into her reality without meeting the documents head on. I promised myself I would refuse to be graded on quiet while he was awarded for calm. I promised myself I would defend the ordinary with the ferocity that extraordinary usually demands. When the judge asked whether we were ready to proceed on cross, Nora nodded with the settled breath of someone who has built a bridge out of receipts and who trusts it to hold. She circled presence on her legal pad and slid it toward me as if to say, "This is the word that carries the weight you feel," and I pressed my fingertip against the ink and felt steadier for naming the hinge. The clerk approaches our table, slips a stapled printout beside Nora's elbow, and I watch my attorney's eyes tighten as she reads an email chain where Ms. Dale and Pierce discuss narrative alignment. When I pressed play, I heard what I feared, my voice cracking, and what I needed, theirs. The email chain about narrative alignment was still face up on the table when Nora angled the small recorder toward the microphone at counsel's lectern. The way you angle a lamp so it illuminates what mattered and leaves the rest in shadow. I could feel the courtroom's attention lean forward in increments, breath by breath, the quiet building a kind of canopy over us. We had prepped the foundation because family court can be allergic to surprises. The chain of custody form sat clipped to the front of my blue folder, where the device ID matched the purchase receipt and the date stamps that tracked each clip from the morning they were made to the metadata check Nora ran last night. She wrote the file hash in blue ink on the cover sheet. No decimals to fake certainty, just a long spine of characters that says, "This is what it is," unaltered. And I could tell by the judge's expression that he had seen people try to smuggle rage into evidence. We weren't smuggling anything. We were asking the room to listen to the air we had lived in. Pierce objected to playing theatrics, and Nora answered with the calm cadence that makes even impatience sound professional, reminding the court the audio was offered for a limited purpose, impeachment, not for the truth of the matter asserted, not as a dramatic soundtrack, for the simple function of showing how words came out of mouths that now pretended they had not formed them. My thumb found the locket at my throat without my permission, heat sliding into metal like a small tide. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hands steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes. Breath resets. Let the paper speak and let my child lift his head. Paper would lead today, but sound would bring the room to where the paper was born. Clip 1 opened with the dull hum of the courthouse hallway, that fluorescent buzz that makes even laughter sound institutional. Then my voice entered, thinner than I remembered, asking for respect, and the crack is there, unavoidable, brief, the audible version of a knee that remembered a fall before it stood up. The next voice belongs to Pierce, and he is closer to the recorder than he realized. He chuckles and says, "Relax, we all know you're the help." And the words are wrapped in a smile you can hear but cannot cross-examine without playback. Evan's laugh trails behind, soft, complicit, the kind of sound that wants to pass as nothing so it can stay everything. Ms. Dale's voice follows, pitched to soothe as she murmurs, "Keep it cute." And you can hear the smirk hiding under cultured concern. There's the shuffle of papers, a printer spitting a job 2 rooms away, the theater of bureaucracy doing its little dance, and then my breath catching and smoothing as I say, "I'm not the help, I'm her mother." The sentence does not sound triumphant. It sounds like someone bracing a door with her shoulder before the wind tests the latch. The judge kept his face still, but his hands stopped moving. Nora paused the playback and laid the foundation again in a single clean sentence, naming the time and place, the device ID, the hash, the fact that I was a party to the conversation in a one-party consent state, and the fact that we were not asking the court to treat the statements as substantive truth, but to consider them when weighing credibility and context. Pierce tried to argue that hallway talk is meaningless chatter, but the courtroom is a magnet. It draws meaning out of what people want to call casual. He shifted to suggesting the audio was edited to dramatize, and Nora invited him to name the discontinuity. He did not. Clip 2 began more quietly, recorded in my kitchen 3 days after the first, because truth leaves a trail if you follow it long enough. The inhaler chimed in the background, the kind of domestic music that makes an expert's report look thin, and Ms. Dale said, clear as a bell, "We'll just count last week's canceled visit as completed for the purposes of even coverage." Her voice did not carry malice. It carried efficiency, that humble brag of fairness that costs the person who is already doing the work. You can hear the scrape of my chair as I stand to silence the inhaler timer. You can hear my daughter's pencil tap the table twice before she returns to the last page of her spelling list, and you can hear me say, carefully, "But it didn't happen." The silence that followed grew and grew until Ms. Dale filled it with a euphemism. "We'll reflect the intent," she said, and if language is a ledger, that sentence tried to credit an account that had never deposited a minute. I felt the familiar shame rush my skin, the shame of sounding emotional in rooms where men fund calm like a trust account, and I named the risk out loud before anyone else could weaponize it. "Yes, my voice cracks," I said, looking at the judge without apology. "It cracks because my mornings are already in this folder, and my child's breath is in these notes, and because people who were not there get to summarize what I did as if it were a performance, not a life." Nora didn't touch my arm. I didn't need her to. This wasn't a speech. It was a calibration, an acknowledgement that emotion and evidence are not enemies, that a crack can coexist with competence the way weather coexists with the road you still choose to drive. To make my point quietly and entirely, I reached into the blue folder and slid the parking receipt to the front sleeve, the small rectangle that matches time against tail. The timestamp sat a minute off the school's kiosk entry because their clock runs a touch slow. I had already printed the email from the IT director who confirmed the offset last winter when the district updated servers. This was what my mornings looked like when no one watched, a ledger of small, precise choices, each one made before someone else named me with a word that trivialized the whole. I wanted the court to feel the choreography that hides beneath efficiency, the way a Mother's Day is a series of catches before anyone sees a drop. Pierce tried once more to steer us back to performance, tone, posture, presentation, and Nora refused the detour with a list of dates that clicked down like a safe opening, each number unlocking the next until what we had promised at the start stood in front of us. Not drama, but record. The room was listening in a new way now, the way people listen when they are slightly embarrassed by what they laughed at 20 minutes earlier and are trying to repair their own sense of themselves without admitting it directly. Ms. Dale smoothed her skirt, a nervous ritual masquerading as poise, and I watched her pretend to be bored while her pupils betrayed the sprint of her pulse. The judge adjusts his robe, eyes on the recorder, and says, "Admitted for limited purpose. Ms. Carter, do you have more than feelings?" If love is measured in minutes, I brought the ledger. The audio's last echo was still thinning in the air when Nora lifted our exhibit binder like a steadying heart and opened to the calendar that had built itself month by month on my kitchen wall before it ever became evidence. Color ran in quiet bands across the grid, blue for drop-offs, yellow for pickups, green for pediatric calls, orange for therapy, purple for teacher confirmations, and the hues carried the story more cleanly than any adjective ever could. We walked the bench through September's first week, then the second. Not to prove I was a hero, but to prove I was there, which is the quieter heroism the world keeps misplacing. Each square had a time, each time had a note, and each note had a matching email or portal ping that made the ink audible. Evan countered with prints that glowed like brochures for a life we did not live Monday through Friday. Carousel smiles, pumpkin patch portraits, the moment his hands tied a cleat in golden light while someone else angled the camera to capture virtue without context, and a month of soccer practices circled like a medal ceremony on his phone. The photos were lovely because weekends are designed to be, and for a moment I hated them for how easily beauty wins an argument with people who are tired. Then I remembered the ledger. The ledger is not pretty, it is precise. I listened to my own breath settle, the way you listen for a baby's calming after a cough, and I let the grid speak. The teacher emails were less cinematic and more useful. We read the lines that live in the space between praise and relief. Thank you for the consistent morning check-ins. Appreciate the inhaler reminder before PE. Noted that you arranged the speech therapy pullout so she won't miss read aloud. And the record grew a backbone. One thread mentioned the parent-teacher conference where Evan never arrived and where I sat alone with 2 chairs pulled up, one for hope and one for habit. The timestamp on the teacher's follow-up landed at 7:14 p.m., 15 minutes after she waited past the slot because she believed, against all available data, that he would burst in with ready contrition. He did not. I did not write an opinion about it. I wrote the time. Pierce tried to reframe the calendar as obsession and my exhibit tabbing as petty litigious behavior masquerading as care, and he let the words linger like smoke that wants to be mistaken for fog. I felt the old heat in my face that usually precedes a stumble, and I rehearsed the sequence that has become my bridge from feeling to fact. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hand steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets, let the paper speak, and let my child lift his head. When I answered, I did not defend my personality. I defended the system of tracking that keeps kids from becoming collateral damage to adults' spin. This is not fury, I said. This is record keeping. The judge did not smile, but his pen started moving again. On cross, Nora did what good lawyers do when they refuse to be hypnotized by varnish. She returned us to Ms. Dale's favorite verb. In your report, you say the father presents as primary, correct? She asked, and when Ms. Dale nodded, Nora paused just long enough to make the next question land, on clean ground. You did not write is primary, you wrote presence as primary. That was a deliberate choice? Ms. Dale said the choice was semantic, and the air in the room tilted as if someone had placed a nickel under one leg of the table. Words matter, Nora said, calm as rain. Presence acknowledges performance, not proof. Then she placed the canceled weekday visit on the rail like a stone, reminded the court that it had been rescheduled to flatter cadence rather than capture routine, and slid the emails about narrative alignment into the light. Ms. Dale resisted in the tone of people who believe resistance can be mistaken for fairness, explaining that modern evaluation balances data with observed affect. And I felt the word affect scratch at the inside of my ribs. Affect is the thing you wear. Work is the thing you do. We had brought the work. Nora pushed gently but precisely, asking why a canceled visit could be counted as completed for even coverage, when an inhaler plan, logged daily, was treated as administrative noise. The judge asked for page cites, and Nora answered with headers and minutes. Nothing about her voice rose, and that made the truth sound taller. I traced one blue column of drop-offs with my fingertip, naming the mornings not allowed but inside. Library day, where the backpack needed the special bag. Art day, where the paint shirt had to be found. Thursday, where the speech therapy pullout meant a front office sign-in rather than a classroom handoff. I remembered the sock drawer game, the breath-counting nights, the smell of oatmeal, the note I write before spelling quizzes that says only proud of you, because a child should not have to decode adult fear before homeroom. I remembered how the ledger began the week Evan moved out, not because I foresaw litigation, but because I needed a way to prove to myself that ours could hold when a home had been broken into pieces that still had to fit our child. Pierce returned to tone because tone was the only tool that made me look smaller than my minutes. He suggested the color coding signaled a control issue, and I suggested the color coding signaled exactly what it looked like, a plan of care that did not depend on mood to function. He asked whether I ever forgot a pickup, and I said yes. Once I was 20 minutes late because the freeway closed for a crash, and I played the voicemail from the aftercare teacher who said, with kindness, "You're always early. It's okay to be human." And then I produced a district push alert that documented the closure. Minutes stacked themselves like bricks you could stand on. Nora returned to Miss Dale with the patience of someone unbraiding a knot. She asked for the specific basis, beyond decor and vocal steadiness, for the presence as primary conclusion. She asked whether the evaluator had verified the school portal access logs. She asked whether the evaluator had interviewed the nurse instead of emailing. She asked whether the evaluator had corrected the report when she learned the canceled visit had been counted as completed. By the time she finished, the gap between appears and is had widened into a small canyon, not dramatic, just undeniable. When my breath tried to hurry, I slowed it, because speed is a cousin of panic, and I have learned to keep panic as a guest, not a host. I let the colors work. I let the stamps talk. I let the ledger carry what my voice had already survived. The room had the sound a courtroom gets when it is deciding whether to be fair today. You can hear the decision before you see it. The pens pausing, the bodies leaning, the paper taking on a kind of hush. Then Nora's phone lights up on the table between us, a silent flash that slices the moment, and the screen shows a text from an unknown number. Pull traffic cam. Maple and 3rd, 7:22 a.m. A frozen frame did what a polite room wouldn't. It told the truth plainly. The text on Nora's screen hit like a gavel we had prayed would fall in our direction, only quieter, just a sharp white flash of numbers that knew exactly where they had been. She read it once and then twice, as if confirmation could lengthen the window we suddenly had, and asked the court for a brief recess to retrieve municipal footage from the traffic portal. The judge granted 5 minutes with the wary caution of someone who has seen many last-minute exhibits arrive in a blaze and burn out on contact. He didn't know that this wasn't a blaze. It was a timestamp, and timestamps do not posture. Nora moved with the purposeful calm of a nurse in a hallway at 3 a.m, passing our table to the clerk's window where the portal login can be requested and authenticated, then explaining what she needed without the tiniest whiff of theater, because the footage would provide its own stage. The portal processed while the courtroom shifted in small animal ways, feet stretching in shoes, a cough swallowed, papers reorganized in stacks that had already declared their loyalties. I felt the hum of the fluorescence the way you feel the ocean under a ferry, steady, indifferent in a way that almost felt merciful. I kept my hand on the blue folder and my fingertip pressed against the edge of the parking receipt at the front, the paper warming as if heat could move backwards from skin to ink and bless it. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hand steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets, let the paper speak, and let my child lift his head. Machines have no reason to flatter fathers or scold mothers. They have only captured light and the time the light was captured, which is to say, they have memory without motive. When the clerk handed Nora the certified still and the link for live display on the court screen, the room obeyed without being told. Heads lifted, pens paused, the bailiff angled the monitor, and 3 rows leaned forward in a synchronized movement that made me think of little league parents trying to see a play at the plate. Nora narrated only what was necessary, the way a pilot names altitude and heading before a landing that is entirely routine if you know how to watch. Maple and 3rd, she said. School zone camera, Tuesday, September 12th. The still appeared with its municipal watermark and its unforgiving clarity. My car sat in the frame at 7:22 a.m., nose even with the crosswalk's first thick stripe, the sticker in the window visible if you knew where to look, and the shape of the car exactly as I know it when I see it from the kitchen window, and count breaths between sips of coffee before we leave. No one applauded, of course. Courtrooms do not clap for truth. They edit themselves into silence and then try to hold it like a meaningful thing. Nora placed the still on the evidence rail, the paper grossly ordinary beneath the weight of what it carried, and then she moved to the kiosk log we had already marked for identification. School entry system, visitor sign-in, she said. Mother's signature at 7:31 a.m. Staff initials ML. The judge glanced at the screen, then at the log, and I could see the moment he allowed the gap to be what it was. A 9-minute glide from traffic to front desk, the sacred space of mornings where backpacks are shifted and kisses are placed, and the day is launched like a small ship someone loves more than life. Pierce pivoted so fast the movement raised a draft. He called it a one-off exception, a lucky coincidence, a morning where perhaps I had insisted, or where Evan had been early first and left, or where cameras had been miscalibrated because technology, as we all know, fails at the worst times. He was smart enough not to challenge the municipal watermark. He was brazen enough to suggest that A still could not know a pattern. If counsel is suggesting that one morning proves an always, he said, then we are in the business of making anecdotes into orders. I felt the room shift in his direction for a breath, and then wander back, hungry and uncertain, the way people look at a weather map and try to decide whether the storm icon means rain on their lawn or somewhere else altogether. Nora did not argue weather. She argued clocks. She laid the receipt beside the still so the timestamp could rest its head next to its twin, only a minute apart because the school system lags by 60 seconds, a fact we had memorialized by email with the district's IT after last winter's server update. She slid that email under the receipt like a foot under a wobbly table leg, and the furniture of our case stopped wobbling. The parking meter knew when I paid. The camera knew when I waited at the crosswalk. The kiosk knew when I wrote my name. And in the ledger, those 3 points formed a small constellation that did not care about anyone's adjectives. The judge asked what day of the week it had been, and I answered without looking at my notes because my body had kept it. Tuesday, the day PE meets second period, the day inhalers need to be checked twice, the day library books must be returned to avoid the frown the librarian tries to hide behind good manners. He wrote Tuesday as if the day itself had entered testimony, and I thought briefly and with a tenderness I did not have time to indulge about how much of mothering is the faithful return to Tuesday. Evan kept his eyes on the tabletop, where his thumbnail worried at a slick place in the veneer, until the shine dulled and his reflection blurred. For a long breath, no one moved. Then the room exhaled in the way rooms do when they have decided to be less polite with reality. Pierce cleared his throat and changed the subject without admitting it, shifting to a stack of pages held together with a black clip that had lost one plastic tooth. He said that, coincidentally, new social worker notes had surfaced that very morning, notes which speak to the father's consistent involvement and should be weighed by the court in the interest of balanced evaluation. He called them contemporaneous. He called them corroborative. He called them fresh, as if freshness were an argument. He lifts the clip, fans the thin stack so the pages whisper like grass before a storm, and announces, "We have new social worker notes discovered today." Their notes had no case number, just conclusions dressed as facts. Pierce fanned the staple pages as if the whisper of paper could stand in for provenance, and I felt the room's attention try to decide whether novelty might be a cousin of truth. Nora asked for the packet, took one long look, and then the part of her face that belongs to math, angles and lines and the steady refusal of guesswork, settled into place. No header, no date, no case ID. Initials at the bottom of each page, like someone nervous about leaving fingerprints. The margins weren't court standard. The font wasn't the one social services uses on forms. The spacing was the kind you get when a person types too fast and prints without proofreading because the content felt sufficient to outrun the rules. We all know this move: perform authority and hope no one asks for its badge. Nora stood, objection ready and unadorned, and reminded the court that foundation is not a snobbery. It is a staircase. Without a header, we don't know who wrote the notes. Without a date, we don't know when. Without a case number, we don't know for whom. Without a full name under those initials, we don't know whether the writer is a stranger to our lives or a familiar with a stake in the ending. The judge sustained in part, which is the sound of fairness with one eyebrow raised, and allowed limited use pending authentication. The pages could be looked at, not leaned on, the way you might glance at weather through a window without calling it a forecast. While Pierce rephrased, contemporaneous into a softer synonym, I read the initials again and felt recognition prick like a tack underfoot. The letters belonged to someone I had met once at a birthday party, a friend of Evan's sister who worked for a social services nonprofit and who had volunteered a monologue about balanced homes while my daughter blew out candles and swallowed smoke with her wish. I whispered the name to Nora, and she asked, polite as a librarian but with the spine of cross-examination, whether the author had any relationship to either party. Pierce said he had been told the writer was familiar with the family. Familiar is the word people use when they do not want to say involved. We traced the friendship publicly, but without malice. The judge listened as Nora laid out the conflict angle, photos from the same charity gala, comments exchanged on the sisters' post, a babysitter joke liked by the very account that now signed these notes with 3 tidy initials. No one needs to be a villain to be disqualified. They only need proximity that bends their gaze. Pierce tried to float above this like a hot air balloon. Community overlap. Small town dynamics. But the court is not a sky. It is a ledger. Overlap can be bias wearing cologne. I kept my palm on the blue folder, steadying my breath by the texture of plastic and paper, and felt the recorder in my pocket blink a patient red. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hand steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets, let the paper speak, and let my child lift his head. I would not be shamed for wanting the spine of a story to be a spine, not a ribbon. Then came the twist that tasted familiar. Ms. Dale cleared her throat and offered that she had consulted those notes during her evaluation to round out context. The word consulted wore a lab coat, but inside it was a shrug. Nora turned toward her with the gentleness that often precedes a pull of thread. So you considered external notes of unknown authorship, without header, date, or case ID, from an individual socially connected to father's family, and you did not disclose that reliance in your report? Ms. Dale said she had considered many inputs. Nora asked which ones were undisclosed. Ms. Dale said it was common practice to gather community impressions. Nora asked whether the community had faces and names. Ms. Dale said the names weren't mission critical. Nora asked whether the word presents in her report grew out of impressions rather than verified minutes. You could feel the sentence architecture wobble, the way a bookshelf sways when its top screw has been loosened by a hand that thought it was tightening. Pierce tried to sew the pages back into credibility by repeating phrases that had worked earlier in rooms without cameras or clerks, but repetition does not repair absence. The judge's question shifted from whether to admit to whether to trust, and I watched the scales recalibrate, small plates moving under law's quiet mechanics. Nora asked the simplest question last. What day were these notes written? Ms. Dale couldn't say. Pierce couldn't say. The stack couldn't say. We called the school nurse as a counterweight, not because our case needed drama, but because it needed balance where an unverified pile had tried to lean. The remote connection connected on the first try. Her backdrop was a poster about hand washing and a shelf of labeled tubs, and the ordinariness of her square on the screen felt like oxygen. She spoke with the exact cadence of a person who spends her days keeping small bodies safe. Precise, warm, unhurried. She described the asthma action plan, the green-yellow-red zones, the way we'd updated the inhaler timing at the start of the semester, the day she trained me on the spacer again because I asked for a refresh, and the morning she had watched me sign my name after dropping off medication so it would live in the nurse's station instead of in a backpack. She mentioned how, when attendance blips coincided with cough season, I emailed before the bell so the teacher wouldn't worry. She mentioned how Evan had called once for instructions, polite and earnest, and how she had emailed him the plan I had already printed and taped to our fridge. The nurse did not call me a hero. She called me mother by using my name in sentences that began with she regularly and she consistently, and she followed up. The verbs did the work. The screen went quiet after she finished because there is not much to say after plain work has been named by someone whose job is to notice what keeps children breathing. Even Pierce's shoulders lowered, the way shoulders do when resistance has run out of headlines. I stared at the 3 little initials on the loose pages and felt almost sorry for them. They wanted to be a spine, and they were only thread. The court clerk slid the packet back across the rail, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the plastic cover of my folder. Eyes steadier than I felt, mouth at rest, jaw unclenched. as if the room had loaned me back to myself for a minute. We had spent an hour arguing the difference between performance and proof. Now the difference stood on paper, and it could carry weight. The judge straightens a stack on his bench, looks over his reading glasses at both tables, and says, "I'm prepared to read a temporary order." When he set the page and squared his shoulders, I felt history try to harden. The sound was not dramatic, only the soft thud of paper meeting wood, but the room responded the way people do when they believe the ending has already been drafted, and all that remains is the ceremony of reading it out loud. The judge adjusted his glasses and announced the court's framing, a high conflict matter requiring an emphasis on stability and the weight of neutral evaluation. I could feel the Soviet sense. Label tried to climb my back like a harness somebody else gets to steer. High conflict means they see heat and presume fault, and stability becomes a synonym for the person who made you quiet. He listed the sources he would rely on: evaluator report, verified exhibits, sworn statements, and the order of them mattered because the first thing named is the first thing believed. Ms. Dale's file sat on top of our ledger like a pressed leaf pretending to be the whole tree. He began with a draft tilt I recognized from the whispers outside chambers, a lean that favored Evan for school year custody on the grounds of calm presentation, as if composure were a credential and urgency a misdemeanor. He noted my diligence, he praised my documentation, and then he reached for that soft, tired phrase, "Evaluators love." Mother appears highly invested, which is the genteel cousin of too much. He did not say babysitter, but the echo drifted from the gallery anyway, a memory moving through bodies. I felt it land the way a hand lands on a shoulder that isn't asking to be guided. I kept my mouth closed and let my spine answer, straightening in the chair with the small, slow certainty that does not care who is looking. Nora did not interrupt. She waited for the pause judges leave when they think they have anticipated every last motion. In that seam she rose, voice level, and requested leave for a late-filed exhibit consisting of a voicemail transcript and a longitudinal attendance trend covering September through November. Pierce began to object before she finished the sentence, citing sandbagging and prejudice, but the judge lifted a palm without looking at him, which is as close to shushing as benches get. He asked for the proffer. Nora named it cleanly, a teacher's voicemail, thanking me for scheduling and transporting our daughter to speech therapy pullouts, verifying weekday involvement contested by father, and a trendline of arrivals and absences built from the school's own data, with annotations cross-referenced to portal IP logs and nurse station sign-ins. I watched the judge's eyes scan the top line of the transcript as if reluctant curiosity might be safer than attention. It began the way ordinary proof always begins, in a voice that belongs to someone who is not trying to be brave or persuasive, just decent. "Hi, this is Miss Lang," the teacher said, vowels familiar even in print. "I wanted to thank you for reorganizing her speech sessions so she doesn't miss read aloud and for doing pickups on the days I emailed. She's more confident this week, I see it." The message had a date and timestamp that sat inside the period Evan reported he was handling weekday logistics. It also had the simple grace of a person testifying without knowing she's testifying, the way a witness becomes one by telling the truth to no one in particular. The trend line did not glow. It clicked. Nora projected the graph onto the courtroom screen and walked the months slowly, the kind of tour a parent gives a child through a museum when the point is not to rush toward the dinosaur, but to learn how to see. Each dot marked an arrival. Each absence carried a note. Each late slip wore initials that matched mine, except for the Friday Evan handled when I was out of state, and he signed right on the line. Memorable because he took a photo of himself doing it and posted a caption about showing up, which we have never disputed he can do. We dispute who does it most of the time. The graph didn't accuse, it remembered. Machines remember what people edit. I could feel the room recalibrate, the ruler shifting from adjectives to minutes. Pierce went for tone because tone is the only solvent he had left. He called my record litigation theater, and Nora held up the school's export tag, the nurse's initials, the portal IP log, each as unglamorous as a bolt, and we used them like hardware, building something load-bearing right in front of everyone. He called the voicemail gratitude, not allocation of duties, and Nora nodded, agreeing where agreement cost nothing. then pointed to the phrase doing pickups and let the second half of the sentence land without commentary. The judge reread the line the way people reread when they are deciding whether to betray their own first impression. I felt the old tremor try to fuss at my breath, and I let it announce itself so it could also pass. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hands steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets, let the paper speak, and let my child lift his head. I pictured Tuesday's crosswalk again, the municipal still with its municipal mercy, and I placed my hand flat on the blue folder as if to ground myself in the truth we had already paid for in mornings. I realized then that the order the judge thought he was about to read had been drafted by rooms I'd never entered, and that my job today was not to fight the room, it was to introduce it to mine. The judge cleared his throat, discomfort showing up as an adjustment to the neatness of his stack. He said the words courts use when they're revising without admitting they're revising, having now considered, and asked Nora to summarize the trend in 14 seconds. She did it in 12, not because speed impresses, but because clarity refuses to waste time, when the child in question will need to be picked up at 2:45 if the meeting runs long. He looked at the evaluator's paragraph about presence as primary, and I watched the hinge of that verb creak. From the gallery, someone coughed in a way that wanted to be a laugh and then thought better of it. Evan stared at the tabletop as if gloss might yield a reflection more flattering than the one the screen currently offered. Ms. Dale's pen stopped moving. The bailiff repositioned his weight, a human barometer I trusted more than the weather on Pierce's face. Room's breath sank to the judge's inhale, and for a moment I knew what it felt like to pause a river with documents. He taps a column with the back of his pen and says, "Ms. Carter, explain September's attendance pattern on the record." They gave me 1 minute. I gave them mornings. The judge's pen hovered like a metronome, and when he nodded for me to begin, I felt the clock start inside my ribs, not as panic, but as pacing, a rhythm I recognize from every day I have ever tried to get a child out the door on time without turning our kitchen into a drill field. I said September 1st, and then told him about the humidifier mist lifting while the cereal softened, how the inhaler timer chimes before the oatmeal cools, so we never have to choose between breath and breakfast, and how the spacer's tiny plastic mouthpiece gets warmed between my palms because it fits her face better when it isn't cold. I described the sock drawer game we invented to beat the clock, where she hunts the pair with the embroidered stars and gets a tally mark on the whiteboard if she finds them before I finish pouring milk, and how that whiteboard isn't about compliance so much as confidence, a way to let a small girl feel fast and good at the day before the day has a chance to judge her. I told him that sight words live on index cards rubber banded in the visor, that at the first light after maple we whisper the card and then say it out loud, and at the second light we turn it into a sentence about the librarian's cat or the gym teacher's whistle, and at the third the word gets tucked back into the stack and a new one comes forward like a shy kid at a classroom door. I told him about the school portal login pinging at 6:41 from my IP, about the autofill that knows our district URL better than my work calendar does, and about the absurd intimacy of memorizing a nurse's extension, because the difference between a good morning and an emergency is sometimes a question asked 1 minute early. The ledger is a map, I said, but the map is made of these tiny choices. Count breaths, pack the backup inhaler, remember library day, so the book about whales doesn't accrue fines that make reading feel like punishment. I did not ask the court to love my tone. I asked it to follow my trail. The portal logs show my name under every excused absence except one, the freeway crash Friday, where the district's push alert documented what everyone in town remembers, and the therapy invoices are billed to me because the office needed one card to store and one person who would pick up the phone at lunch, which became my role not because Evan wouldn't, but because I always did. I described how speech therapy was moved from the middle of read aloud to the end of math, so confidence could join fluency rather than collide with joy, and how the teacher's voicemail thanking me sits in the ledger, because gratitude is also a kind of timestamp when it names the work that got done. I named the thing I had been told not to name, because the body tells on you anyway when you're trying to make yourself small for someone else's comfort. Yes, my voice cracks, I said, steady eyes on the bench, and I can tell you the weight of that crack. It is grief and it is fatigue and it is love insisting on clarity rather than decorum. Then I laid competence beside it, the way you set a level on a shelf to show it doesn't need your faith to be straight. I spoke about the binder tabs and the color coding and the email confirmations that matched the nurse's initials, not as personality quirks, but as mechanisms designed to prevent a real child from becoming the victim of adult adjectives. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ms. Dale shift, a small collapse in posture that happens when a word returns to haunt its owner, because Nora had outlined presence in ink so thick it might as well have been carved, and in this minute the court could see exactly what the verb had tried to do, recast a performance as a fact and a room's impression as a child's life. The difference between presence and it stood up and stretched its legs, and even from counsel table it was impossible not to notice how the evaluator's neutrality looked suddenly less like balance and more like a chosen angle. I didn't savor it. I handed the court the moment like a tool, because tools belong to whoever is building. I promised, aloud and without ornament, that if anyone insisted on calling me a babysitter after I finished speaking, they would not be able to pretend they were doing it out of ignorance. They would be doing it in defiance of the record, against timestamps and invoices and signatures, against the voice of a teacher whose job is to grow readers, and the testimony of a nurse whose job is to keep small lungs open. I said that mornings are not a performance you can curate for a camera. Mornings are a custody of minutes, and I have been their custodian, not as a martyr but as a mother, which is to say as a person who routinely trades sleep for steadiness and vanity for verification. The judge did not smile, which I did not require. He looked down at the attendance trend again, and I kept talking, quick but not hurried, like I was reading a recipe to someone who could already smell the bread. I told him about Thursdays when the speech pullout means we check in at the front office because arriving to class mid-lesson can turn a brave kid into a quiet one, and about the way I used to send a photo of the inhaler to my own phone as a redundant reminder because redundancy is what care looks like when you cannot afford an error. I told him that Evan can be good at weekends and that weekends count, and I told him that weekdays count too, and that counting is what I have brought him today. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hand steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets, let the paper speak, and let my child lift his head. I steadied my palm on the blue folder and said nothing more, because there is a point at which additional words get in the way of the weight you have properly placed, and I could feel that I had reached it, the way you know when a backpack is zipped, and there is nothing left that needs to be rescued from the kitchen counter. The bailiff steps back into the room, holding a disc envelope and a staple packet, and announces, "Certified traffic media and nurse's affidavit, time-stamped." Truth didn't roar. It clicked into place, exhibit by exhibit. The bailiff's envelope crossed the room like a modest messenger that knew it didn't need to bow. Nora stacked the pieces in the order we had promised the court and the clock: certified traffic media, the attendance trend, the voicemail transcript, the nurse's affidavit. She didn't flourish, she aligned. The screen woke to the maple and third still, watermark bright as a street lamp at dawn. The graph followed, an arc of mornings that looked almost pretty if you didn't understand what beauty costs. Then the teacher's voice in typed lines, then the nurse's sworn paragraphs where medicine's everyday grammar held firm. One click, then another, and the room's posture changed from skeptical to listening. The judge narrated the way pilots narrate altitude. A few words, just enough for passengers to feel the plane. He marked the car at 7:22 a.m., noted the kiosk signature at 7:31 with staff initials, traced the trendline's run of on-time arrivals, and read aloud the line from Miss Lang. "Thank you for reorganizing speech so she doesn't miss read aloud, and for doing pickups on the days I emailed." The words left the page and became a wall no one could politely walk through. He turned to the nurse's affidavit and lingered on phrases that have no appetite for drama. Consistently. Per plan. Updated. Signed. Plain diction laid out like instruments on a sterile tray. You can hear a credibility swing when it happens. It makes paper louder and voices softer. The judge compared Evan's sworn statements, weekday dominance, primary logistics, to the minutes on the screen. He did it gently, which made it worse. "Counsel," he said to Pierce, "we have several inconsistencies." He listed them, not to scold but to count, and the counting, those tidy numerals, did what my testimony alone could not. Evan's eyes narrowed, then emptied, and his fingers began the quiet tap. Anyone who has loved him learns to dread. I felt nothing triumphant. I felt a hinge move. Pierce scrambled toward a familiar fire exit. Prejudice. He moved to exclude the traffic still as unduly prejudicial, the graph as misleading extrapolation, the voicemail as gratitude not allocation, and the affidavit as process heavy but context light. The judge denied, his tone as unadorned as a checklist, and explained in 3 clean sentences why each piece went not to theatrics but to wait. What had been framed as a mother's obsessive ledger reintroduced itself as a record a child lives inside. What had been mocked as pettiness resolved into pattern. The law does not love anyone. Today it respected the minutes. Then the false ally cost came due. Nora stepped back to Miss Dale with the restraint of a surgeon who prefers sutures to cautery. You wrote presence as primary, she said, and you consulted notes without header, date, or case number from an author socially connected to father's family without disclosing that reliance. Miss Dale tried to center holistic impressions. Nora centered chain of custody. The judge ordered an amended report within 14 days, directed full disclosure of all off-record communications, and forbade further reliance on anonymous community notes absent authentication. In a softer voice, he added that sarcasm transcribed as confession is a professional hazard evaluators must avoid, and I watched Ms. Dale's mouth press thin around a sentence she didn't speak. Something inside me let go of its death grip on the recorder. I realized my thumb had stopped checking the red blink. It hadn't moved since the traffic still appeared. My voice didn't need a witness to prove it existed. The room, for once, was doing what a room is supposed to do, convert air into paper without changing the meaning along the way. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hand steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets, let the paper speak and let my child lift his head. I could almost hear my daughter's pencil tapping her desk 2 towns away, the rhythm she uses when she feels brave. Nora asked the court to take judicial notice of how rumors fail the rules. The babysitter thread had been stapled to me by people who liked the taste of certainty more than the labor of checking. Pierce tried to float a printout into the record as community perception. The judge slid it back with a fingertip. Hearsay, he said, and the word moved through the gallery like a small cleansing wind. In a single breath, the thread turned from a verdict into a rumor again, and rumor looks small when the light is good. Evan asked to speak and then didn't, a habit that used to pull me towards soothing, and now just made me tired. His lawyer did the speaking for him, promising cooperation with amended evaluations and transparency with calendars going forward, and I watched the phrase going forward put on its cape and try to fly away from September. Nora kept us tethered to the months the court could actually reach. She restated the minimum, that any temporary arrangement should honor the minutes, while the amended report corrects its verbs. Nothing elaborate, nothing vengeful. Mornings preserved. The judge began to stack the exhibits into a new order, and I understood that sequence is its own verdict. Traffic still on top. Graph next, voicemail, affidavit. Then, finally, the evaluator's report, demoted from lodestar to disputed item, a document that would need revision rather than reverence. Ms. Dale's pen resumed its slow movement. Pierce's pen stopped. The bailiff relaxed by half an inch. Even the fluorescent hum seemed to settle on a lower note, as if the building liked its own acoustics better this way. I thought of Tuesday, of library day, of the sock drawer game, of the way my daughter checks for my eyes before she reads a tricky word and then pushes through because she sees me nod. I thought of the parking receipt nestled behind her photo in my locket, the private ritual I had already decided upon even if no one else ever knew. I thought of how many women I've known who keep the minutes and get called names for keeping them, how many men I've known who keep the narrative and get thanked. I didn't look at the gallery. I looked at the bench. The judge clears his throat, adjusts the stack one last time, and says, "I'm revising the order. Listen carefully." The word parent sounded ordinary, until it finally meant me. He read the revisions without ceremony, which is how real change arrives in rooms that distrust applause. The temporary order, as revised, set the school year on a week-on, week-off rotation, not because symmetry is pretty, but because the minutes we had laid down on paper required a structure that honored them, and he named joint medical decision-making as an explicit mandate rather than a courtesy, with the caution that medical adherence would be monitored through the nurse's station logs. He said the line slowly. The court finds mother to be a primary engaged caregiver, and the sentence lodged where breath had once snagged. I felt the room's temperature shift by a single honest degree. The word primary no longer hovered as a shadow of presentation. It landed as a fact. He issued directives the way scaffolding is erected around a building that intends to stay standing. An evaluator addendum would be due within 14 days, not with new adjectives, but with corrected verbs, and all off-record communications, including the emails about narrative alignment, were to be disclosed to both parties and appended to the addendum for the court's review. The unauthenticated community notes were formally stricken, not condemned as evil, only identified as what they were, thread without a spine. A civility order was imposed, which sounded quaint until the judge looked at both tables and clarified that it covered counsel, parties, and whispering galleries. He did not need to say babysitter because rebukes do not have to repeat the insult to end it. There was no single blaze of justice, only the steady arithmetic of sentences that repaired what vagueness had broken. He explained the exchange schedule in plain lines that could be read by tired parents at kitchen tables without lawyers present, and he indexed the drop-off times to the school's kiosk clock, rather than anyone's wristwatch, because wristwatches can pretend to be right and kiosks cannot. He required confirmation emails for therapy pickup sent to both parents, and he spoke a short paragraph about the difference between control and care that would have sounded sanctimonious if he hadn't earned the right to say it by listening when it counted. While he spoke, I felt my blue folder get lighter, not because pages disappeared, but because the paper had been allowed to take its weight off my body and rest on the record where it belonged. When he turned to Ms. Dale, his voice did not sharpen. It steadied. "Your language matters, Ms. Dale," he said, and the line had the quiet mercy of instruction. He asked for updated findings that rely on verified behavior and declared that sarcasm collected as confession is a professional hazard to be guarded against rather than rewarded. She nodded with the stiff grace of someone who has been led back across a bridge she did not know she had burned. I did not hate her. I did not forgive her. I watched the verbs change tense in the judge's mouth and thought about how many women must have built ledgers for the day someone remembered to ask for them. The order's last paragraphs were all logistics, and logistics sounded like love to me. He set a shared calendar that would auto-archive, forbade public posting of our child's image without mutual consent, and directed that any school-related communication be mirrored to both of us with the nurse and teacher C said when relevant. He spoke about consequences not as threats, but as gravitational facts. Failures to comply would be weighed against the child's time, not against adult pride, because the court's job is not to re-script reputations, but to protect the day. A 2-second crack inside, a hard swallow, hands steadying, a mother's fire returning to my eyes, breath resets, let the paper speak, and let my child lift his head. When the judge asked whether either party needed clarification, I shook my head and said, "No, Your Honor." And the sentence did not tremble. My recorder sat quiet because it could. My voice did not because it did not have to. Nora pressed her palm to the blue folder and smiled with half her face, which is what victory looks like in places that distrust triumph. In the gallery, someone attempted a tiny laugh that turned into a cough, and the sound folded itself into silence. Pierce whispered in Evan's ear, and for once there was no performance in the way Evan looked at me. It was the quick reconnaissance of a man who has realized his best argument was a mirror. Ms. Lang's voicemail transcript lay on the rail like a small lighthouse that had never asked to be a symbol, and the nurse's affidavit rested beside it with the calm that belongs to people whose daily work is to keep air moving in and out of children. The viral thread that had traveled so far without a spine met the word hearsay on the docket and sat down. When we signed for the certified copies in the clerk's office, the blue folder felt like a suitcase you unpack the day you finally move in, heavier only in the sense that it contained a different kind of weight. My name looked the same in ink. It carried differently in the mouth. I put the parking receipt in my palm, and in a gesture no one asked me to make and no one could have stopped, I opened my locket and slid the small paper behind my daughter's photo. Proof kept where love lives, Not a trophy, a reminder that time is a tender tyrant, and I am its steward for as long as she needs me to be. On the courthouse steps, cold air found the place where adrenaline had been, and it felt like a wash, not a crash. Nora asked how I was, and I said that mornings would be the same tomorrow, which was better than any other word I could have used. If they called you a babysitter while you were mothering, what word would you write into the record? I asked the camera in my mind that had followed me from hallway to bench, the one that belongs to every woman who has ever tabbed a binder so her child would not have to weather someone else's adjectives. The question wasn't for the court, it was for the chorus outside it. We turned toward the elevators, my folder tucked under my arm the way I carry library books, and I caught myself reaching for the recorder before I remembered it could rest. The door opened on a crowd that parted without being told to, not out of deference, but out of the quiet relief that comes when a room has done enough right to let everyone go home. I thought of Tuesday, and Wales, and the sock drawer game, and the way her eyes find mine before the tricky word. I thought of how ordinary the word parent had sounded when other people said it, and how it felt now that it was mine. As we step into the hall, Nora's screen pings, bright against the beige, and the subject line blooms. We need to discuss Ms. Dale's conduct. If you've ever been mislabeled while doing the real work, drop 1 minute that proved it in the comments. I'm reading every story. Share this with someone fighting a system that rewards presentation over proof. Your forward could help. Subscribe and turn on notifications for the next chapter, where I break down how to build a clean evidence ledger without burning out. If you want my toolkit, templates, exhibit checklists, question scripts, comment ledger, and I'll send it in the next upload. And tell me this, when they called you the babysitter while you were mothering, what word would you write into the record?